Welcome back, everybody. Welcome to the Capital Edge Tip Line. I'm Chad Braley, your CEO at Capital Edge. Happy to be back with you this week with some updates on what's kind of going on in government contracting. This session, we're going to talk about some updates from a Defense Contract Audit Agency perspective. Talk a little bit about CAS and some of the changes there. We've talked about that obviously in the past, but kind of just give you what updates obviously we're hearing from an industry perspective. So as we've talked about before, right, cost accounting standards 404, 408, 409, 411 are all on the chopping block. We're assuming, right, with the conformance to GAAP that we're going to have some regulatory guidance actually removing those. As we've talked about in the past, 407 around standard cost, 415 and 416, that's deferred compensation and insurance, are also being evaluated. We're also expecting the CAS board to be coming out with some new thresholds as it relates to when a disclosure statement is required to be submitted. Obviously, we've talked about the CAS threshold changes, I think a couple tip lines ago, that are going to go into effect June 30th of 2026, with full CAS coverage moving to $100 million and the initial quote-unquote trigger / modified CAS kicking in at $35 million. So just a few of the updates that we have going on from that perspective. On the DCAA front, we've seen, so they're creating this new centralized audit function whose primary, and this is going to be more of kind of a headquarters thing that is focused primarily on government property audits, which is something they seem to be moving back to DCAA from DCMA, and also focusing on Truth in Negotiations Act or truthful cost and pricing data audits for defective pricing. So there is creating, obviously, a database of all of the contracts, right, subject to truthful cost and pricing data, and really going to be what the agency's indicated, right, is they're going to focus a lot of their audit efforts on defective pricing as well as property, and both they're going to have a couple different property audits. They refer to them as floor to book and book to floor property audits. So expect that you're going to, for those of you, and I think a lot of this is kind of tied into, right, the DoD or the Department of War, however we want to reference it, nowadays has had issues on their own internal audits of government properties. So they're kind of shifting that focus back to and prioritizing that from a contractor community perspective. So that's going to be coming forward. The other thing is, which has kind of been interesting, right? We've had a NASA contractor who's getting a multi-year incurred cost submission audit. I think it's like 2016 to 2021. That's actually being performed by the Department of the Interior. And the Department of the Interior seems to be performing more ICS audits outside of Department of Interior contracts, which we've never really seen that much of before. Obviously, we're not seeing them necessarily in the DoD space, but we are seeing them in the civilian agency space a little bit more. So I think that's just something to kind of keep an eye on. There's been no specific directive. They've just been kind of popping up and supporting audits for different agencies as of recent. So on the revolutionary FAR overhaul side, we have 31, I believe it was, class deviations for the Department of War that went into effect February 1st, 2026. And the Department of War had kind of been behind on some of those class deviations. We're expecting more class deviations. We're also expecting more deviations as it relates to the revolutionary FAR overhaul from a DFARS and other agency supplemental regulations right outside of DoD. But we do have the first set of class deviations from that perspective coming out of the Department of War. And then there's so many free trade agreements, but the Trade Agreements Act, right? Which many of you are subject to. The thresholds under that act have changed. Obviously, they vary based on the free trade agreements between each of the countries, but just something I think to be cognizant of and pay attention to as those thresholds have all been updated and increased. And again, there's so many free trade agreements. I can't go through all the thresholds in a 5-minute tip line video. We'd be here all day, and you'd get really tired of talking to me about that. And then, the other thing we're starting to kind of see play out a little bit is OTAs, right? And we've seen a lot of OTAs that kind of look like cost reimbursement contracts, even though they're kind of not supposed to look like FAR-based cost reimbursement contracts. But kind of understanding how those play into your incurred cost submissions, from an industry perspective, I think most contractors are including those, right, if you will, on Schedule H, because it's still part of your total cost incurred. You're still identifying costs specific to the OTA, just like you would any other contract. But the auditability of that, with the failure to have potentially 52216-7 allowable cost and payment clause embedded within it, does bring in to play from an audit perspective as to whether or not it's really auditable, if you will, or if that should be excluded from your sample. Should you be going through an ICS audit and be one of the contractors that's not lucky enough to have to have a low risk rating and not really have a review. So just something to keep in mind and keep on top of. If you do have OTAs, we're certainly seeing and have seen over the last several years, kind of started right with the pandemic, but certainly more agreements kind of coming out, and still a contract vehicle that the government seems to be interested in using. So just keep that in mind, obviously, from an auditability perspective. So with that, appreciate your time. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, obviously, don't hesitate to reach out. We're always here, and look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, and have a great one.